The morning the Belhaven courier called His Grace a tyrant who starved his own tenants, I found him standing at the library window with the newspaper crushed in one fist, and I thought, not for the first time, that a man could be feared by an entire county and still look, in that particular light, like a boy who had been struck without warning. I have been steward to the Duke of Thistledown for 11 years, and valet to him for 3 before that, and in all that time I never saw him flinch from a bailiff, a flood, or a horse gone mad in harness. I had seen him ride out into a winter gale to bring a lost shepherd down off the fell, and stand dry-eyed at his father's grave, while half the county wept for a man they had never much liked, and neither of those trials had marked him the way that single morning's newspaper did. But words in print, laid out cold and certain under a stranger's name, could take the color from his face in a way that no accident of nature ever managed. He was called the Onyx Duke by people who had never spoken to him, for his black hair, they said, and his black moods, and a heart they swore was carved from the same stone as his name. I knew him better. I knew that the coldness the county saw was only a door he kept shut because what lay behind it had been hurt once badly and had never fully mended. But knowing a thing and being able to say it to a hostile press are 2 very different arts, and His Grace possessed neither the patience nor the temperament for the second. "They say I raised the rents on the Marsh Lane cottages out of spite," he said that morning, not turning from the window. "They say I mean to enclose the common and starve out old Widow Trent's geese. Half of Belhaven Cross will believe it by Sunday." "Half of Belhaven Cross has believed worse of you on flimsier evidence, Your Grace," I said, which was not comfort precisely, but it was true, and he was not a man who wanted comfort dressed as a lie. He said nothing more that day. But 3 days later, a second broadsheet appeared, not the courier this time, but a plain printed pamphlet, sold for a penny outside the church and passed hand to hand at the market, that answered the courier's charges point by point, with figures, with dates, with a clarity and a controlled fury that read like the work of a barrister who had decided, for reasons of his own, to take up a stranger's cause for nothing. It was signed "Only a Friend to Thistledown." I watched His Grace read it twice at his desk, and the second time, something in his shoulders loosened that had been drawn tight for a week. "Do you know," he said, "I do not know who wrote this, but I would shake his hand." I did not know either, not then. None of us did. It would be the better part of a year before I learned the truth, and when I did, I understood at last why the pamphlets had always seemed to know him, his estate, his tenants, his very heart, better than any stranger reasonably ought. Her name was Miss Surrey's Winthorpe, and she had come to Aldermere Grange, the neighboring estate, some 2 years before as governess to the Ashfords' 2 daughters. I had seen her perhaps a dozen times before that autumn, at church, at the modest assemblies the neighborhood held twice a year, once delivering a message from Mrs. Ashford about a borrowed set of encyclopedias. She was neither the sort of woman who commanded a room nor the sort easily overlooked once you troubled to look properly. She had a quick, watchful face, gray eyes that seemed always to be finishing a thought you hadn't heard the beginning of, and a way of sitting very still in company while, I would later understand, missing absolutely nothing that was said. His Grace, I am ashamed to admit on his behalf, could not have told you the color of her eyes if his estate had depended upon it. He knew her in that first year only as the Ashford governess, a phrase he might have applied equally to a piece of furniture. It was I, in fact, who first connected her to the pamphlets, though I did not know it at the time, only a small, unexamined coincidence that I filed away and forgot. I had gone into Belhaven Cross on an errand for His Grace, to collect a set of bound ledgers from Tuke's print shop on Mill Street, and as I came round the corner I saw Miss Winthorpe leaving that same shop, a covered basket over her arm, her bonnet drawn low against a fine mist of rain. She did not see me. She walked quickly, the way a person walks who does not wish to be asked what she has been doing, and old Tuke stood in his doorway a moment after, watching her go with the particular fondness of a man watching a favorite customer he is sworn not to name. Governesses and their needlework patterns, Tukes said to me, when I asked idly what brought her by, and he said it too quickly and looked for just a moment like a man who had told a lie he did not enjoy telling. I thought nothing more of it. Why should I have? A governess might have any number of small errands, a subscription library book, a letter to a sister, a pattern for lace. I did not think of pamphlets because I did not yet know that the most dangerous weapon raised in defense of the Duke of Thistledown that year was being set in type, letter by careful letter, in that same cramped little shop. The second pamphlet came a month after the first, when the courier printed a piece suggesting his grace meant to close the free school he had endowed for tenant children. In order, the paper implied, with a cruelty dressed up as concern, to spite the county for its low opinion of him. It was a wicked thing to print, because it was aimed not at his pride but at his conscience, and I watched it land in him like a blow. He had built that school for his father's memory, not his own. Old Duke Everard had been a hard man in many ways, but he had believed fiercely that a farmhand's daughter deserved her letters as much as a duke's son, and the school was the one soft thing his grace had ever let himself inherit whole. Let them print what they like, he said too evenly, which was how I always knew he was nearest to breaking. I owe the county no defense. But the county, it seemed, had already found itself a defender who disagreed. Within the week, a friend to Thistledown answered again, this time not with figures but with names. 3 tenant children by name, their fathers' occupations, the exact date each had been admitted to the school, and a closing line that I have never forgotten, because I saw his grace read it standing in the stable yard, oblivious to the rain beginning to fall around him. A man who builds a school for children not his own has spent more on this county's future than any editor who has only ever spent ink. Find out who this is, he said to me that evening, drying his hair by the library fire, something almost like hunger in his voice. I want to thank him properly. A living if he wants one, a position, anything within my gift. No man defends a stranger like this without cause, and I mean to know what I owe him. I made inquiries, as instructed in the careful, roundabout way a steward makes inquiries when he does not wish to seem to be prying. I asked at the print shop. Tukes told me, with an admirable straight face, that the pamphlets came to him already set by a printer's devil in Hartley, 12 miles off, and he only struck the copies for a fee. I asked among the tenants, who knew nothing but were grateful regardless. I asked, eventually, at Aldermere Grange itself, thinking perhaps one of the Ashford sons had a hand in it, for young Mr. Peter Ashford fancied himself something of a wit, and had once threatened to write to the papers about the state of the turnpike road. He denied it, laughing, and asked why I should think it was any Ashford at all. We've none of us the patience for close argument, Penrose. You'd know that if you dined with us. I did not think even then to ask about the governess. Why would I? She was furniture. Pleasant, capable furniture, who kept the Ashford girls' French tolerable and their manners tolerabler, and who occasionally lent Mrs. Ashford a book. It did not occur to any of us, not me, not his grace, not a single soul in Belhaven Cross, that a young woman without fortune or family influence, paid a companion's modest wage, might be the sharpest mind currently employed in the defense of a dukedom. Had I gone to Mill Street on a different errand and at a different hour, I might have caught the truth of it a full year sooner than I did, for the shop itself told the story to anyone who troubled to look past its dust and its clutter of type cases. I had cause that winter to call on Tukes about a set of estate notices, and while I waited for him to finish with another customer, I let my eye wander over the proof sheets pinned along his back wall, curling at the edges, ink still faintly tacky on the newest of them. I did not read them closely. I had no reason to. But I noticed, without quite registering what I noticed, a hand of very small, very even letters penciled in the margin of one sheet, correcting a compositor's error. Not endowed, endowed for, it read. in a script I would come to know as well as my own within the year, though I did not know it then, and Tukes, catching me looking, swept the sheet away with the swift, practiced carelessness of a man who has had a great deal of practice hiding things in plain sight. "Proofs for a sermon," he said, before I had asked. I believed him because I had no cause not to, and because a man rarely suspects a lie he has not been given reason to expect. She came to that shop, I later learned, on the pretext of ordering fresh paper for her pupils' copybooks, or new ribbon for her sewing box, or a dozen other small, unremarkable governess's errands that no one in the county would trouble to question twice. And beneath each pretext, she sat at Tukes' battered composing table in the hour before the Ashford girls' afternoon lessons, setting her arguments down in that same small, even hand, weighing each word the way another woman might weigh a stitch. Because she understood, long before I did, that a careless phrase could undo a man's reputation as surely as a true one could mend it, Tukes never took a farthing more than his printing fee. He told me so himself, afterward, with an old man's quiet pride, as though the keeping of her secret had been the finest piece of work his press had ever done. It was the autumn assembly at the Belhaven Assembly Rooms that first put Miss Winthorpe properly before his Grace's notice, though not, I think, for any reason she would have chosen. He attended those assemblies rarely and unwillingly, out of a sense of obligation to a neighborhood that mistrusted him and a mother, long dead, who had believed a duke owed his tenants at least the courtesy of dancing badly among them twice a year. That autumn, the courier's campaign had left him more raw than usual, and I watched him stand at the edge of the room with the particular stillness of a man enduring rather than enjoying himself, while half the county pretended not to watch him and the other half did not trouble to pretend. It was Miss Winthorpe who spoke to him first, not out of boldness, I think, but because Mrs. Ashford's youngest daughter had torn the hem of her gown against a chair leg, and Miss Winthorpe, kneeling to pin it, found herself directly in the Duke's path when he stepped back to avoid a set of dancers, and nearly toppled them both. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, rising, entirely composed, as if upsetting a duke were a minor and recoverable social error, which I have come to believe was precisely how she saw it. "The fault was mine," he said, which surprised me, for I had rarely heard him take blame he had not earned in a public room. "I was not attending." "No," she agreed, with a directness that made Mrs. Ashford, hovering nearby, go faintly pale. "You seem to be somewhere else entirely." "I hope it was somewhere pleasanter than this room." He looked at her properly then. I saw it happen, the exact moment a man stops seeing a category of person and starts seeing a particular one, and something in his face eased, the way it had eased over the pamphlet, though he could not have told you why the two sensations rhymed. "It was not," he said. "I confess I was thinking of a newspaper editor I should like to see transported." "A common ambition this season, I understand," she said, and there was the smallest curve at the corner of her mouth, gone before Mrs. Ashford could fully disapprove of it. "I hear he has made an enemy of half the parish." "And a friend of the other half, apparently," he said, "though a very mysterious friend who will not give his name." "Perhaps he has good reason not to," she said, and something flickered behind her gray eyes, quick, private, gone almost before I caught it, and then she made her curtsy and returned to her charge's torn hem, and the Duke of Thistledown stood watching her go with an expression I had not seen on him in some years. Simple, unguarded curiosity. "Who is that?" he asked me low, once she was out of earshot. "Miss Winthorpe, Your Grace. Governess to the Ashford girls. She speaks very plainly for a governess." "I understand she is much valued for it," I said, and thought no more of the remark, though I ought to have marked it as the beginning of something. He asked no more questions that night, but he watched her twice more across the room before we left, and on the ride home he was quieter than his usual quiet, which in him was as good as a declaration. The pamphlets continued through the winter, and so, unhurried and unremarked, did a kind of acquaintance between Thistledown and Aldermere Grange that I can only call the slow, accidental architecture of falling in love. Accidental on his part, entirely, for he had no more notion of what was building in him than a man has notion of a house rising around him while he sleeps inside it. He took to calling at the Grange on the thinnest of pretexts: a book to return to Mr. Ashford, an opinion on a hedge boundary that any competent land agent could have settled in 5 minutes, a Christmas basket for the tenants that could easily have been sent by cart. He began, I noticed, to linger in the Grange's small library when Miss Winthrop was at her needlework there with her charges, and to ask her opinion on matters he had never in his life thought to ask a governess's opinion upon: the management of a difficult tenant, the wording of a public notice, whether a certain line in a letter he meant to send the bishop struck her as too severe. "You have a gift for saying a hard thing without cruelty," he told her once in the Grange library, while I waited by the door with a parcel of books he had brought as his excuse for calling. "I have tried all my life and never managed it half so well. I have had a great deal of practice softening truths for other people's children," she said. "It teaches a certain economy of language. One learns which words wound and which merely inform, and how thin the difference can be. I wish you would teach me the trick of it." "I think, Your Grace," she said, with that same private flicker I had seen at the assembly, "you already know more of it than you credit yourself with. I have read your public letters. The one to the parish about the school subscription, that was not the letter of a cruel man, whatever the courier prints." He looked at her sharply then, and I saw something pass over his face that I could not name, not suspicion exactly, but a kind of alertness, as though a bell had rung somewhere in a room he thought empty. "You read the parish notices with unusual attention, Miss Winthrop." "I read everything with unusual attention," she said, perfectly level. "It is an old habit, and a useful one for a governess. Little escapes a woman who has learned to notice what a room is not saying." He let it go. I do not think he suspected her, not truly, not yet, but I have wondered since whether some quieter part of him, the part that had spent a whole autumn and winter being defended by an unseen hand, recognized in her something of the voice that hand wrote in, long before his conscious mind dared to make the connection. He was not a fool. He was only a man so unused to being valued for his better self that he could not quite believe the two people offering him that gift, the anonymous pamphleteer, and the quiet governess whose company he had somehow come to crave more than any drawing-room in the county, might be one and the same. It seemed too great a fortune for a man who had long since stopped expecting fortune of that kind. There was an evening in January I have returned to often since, because I believe it was the evening his Grace first admitted to himself, however briefly and however much he later denied it, that his visits to Aldermere Grange had ceased to be about hedges or bishops or Christmas baskets at all. He had called with some thin excuse about a boundary stone, and stayed 2 hours past any reasonable accounting of that errand, and I stood by, as I always did, half a servant and half a chaperone, while the two of them argued amicably, but in earnest, over whether a poem Mr. Ashford had lent the household that week was sentiment or truth dressed as sentiment. "You read it as though it were a ledger, Your Grace," she told him, laughing, totting up its feelings like a column of figures to see whether the sum comes out honest. "And you read it as though every line deserved the benefit of the doubt," he said, "which I have always thought a dangerous habit in a woman who must, in her profession, see through a great many pretty excuses from small children." "Small children's excuses and a poet's feelings are rarely the same species of falsehood," she said. "A child lies to avoid a scolding. A poet lies usually because the truth would not scan." She looked up at him then, and I saw something pass between them that neither, I think, could yet have named, not flirtation exactly, too grave for that, but a kind of recognition as though each had found, unexpectedly, a mind that met their own stroke for stroke. "You do not trust easily, I think," she said, gentler than her usual bluntness. I do not say that as a fault. I think a man in your position has had good cause to learn caution, but it must be a lonely education. He did not answer at once. It is, he said finally, though I find I mind it rather less than I did a year ago. He did not say why, and I do not think he yet knew why himself, though I, watching them both in the firelight, thought I could already guess. I began, myself, to watch her with a steward's professional suspicion, which is to say the suspicion of a man who loves his master and wishes to know precisely who is permitted near his heart. I noted the quickness with which she answered any mention of the pamphlets, never too quick, never too slow, always exactly as interested as a well-informed neighbor ought to be, and not a hair more. I noted that she asked me once with apparent idleness whether Tuke's print shop still did good custom, and I answered that it did and thought nothing further of it, fool that I was. I noted, most of all, the ink stain that lived, faint but persistent, at the side of her right hand, which she was at some pains to keep gloved or turned from view, and which I told myself, because it was easier, belonged to a woman who wrote a great many letters to a great many relations, as governesses of small means so often must. It was Mrs. Ashford's own cook in the end, who nearly gave the game away entirely, and did not know it. I had gone to the Grange kitchens on an errand in the new year, and fell into conversation with the woman who remarked, with the pride of a servant for a household member she admires, that Miss Winthrop kept the oddest hours some nights, up past midnight with her candle and her lap desk, writing away like a lawyer's clerk, and never a word of it for anybody, though I've asked. I laughed and said governesses must write a great many letters home. The cook agreed, comfortably, that this must be it, and I did not think of the remark again for above 2 months, until the night everything came undone, and it returned to me all at once, whole and obvious, the way a puzzle does the instant after you have finally seen the picture it makes. I had met Silas Crick only twice before that winter, both times at a distance, and both times had come away disliking him rather more than a Christian steward ought to admit to disliking any man. He was small and quick, and given to a smile that never once reached his eyes, and he had nursed his grievance against the house of Thistledown since long before I entered its service, some old quarrel over a boundary hedge with his brother-in-law, a tenant farmer who had lost a suit against the estate years before I came to it, and which Crick had apparently decided, in the manner of small men who mistake a private wound for a public cause, to avenge upon the whole dukedom by way of his newspaper. He was not, I think, entirely without conviction. He told himself, I do not doubt, that he printed only what the county deserved to know, but conviction curdled by spite makes for poor journalism and poorer character, and by that winter his campaign against his grace had less to do with rents or schools than with the pleasure of watching a proud, unpopular man squirm in print. The pamphlets maddened him precisely because they were better argued than anything his own paper managed, and because they had begun, week by week, to cost him readers who preferred a fair fight to a one-sided one. A lesser man might have let the matter drop. Crick was not a lesser man in cunning, whatever he lacked in scruple, and it was that cunning, rather than any real wickedness, that set his printer's devil boy to loitering on Mill Street through the cold weeks of that February. The unmasking, when it came, was not of Miss Winthrop's choosing, and it very nearly ruined everything she had built. Crick, true to the temper I had already come to expect of him, grew so incensed by the pamphlet's continued success that he set his printer's devil boy to watch Tuke's shop, hoping to catch the mysterious friend to Thistledown in the act of collecting proofs. The boy, more diligent than discreet, followed Miss Winthrop from the shop one gray February afternoon all the way to the Grange gates, and reported what he had seen to his master with the breathless pride of a hound bringing home a hare. Crick did not print the accusation outright. He was cleverer than that, and perhaps, in some buried corner of himself, not quite wicked enough for it either. Instead he called at Thistledown itself, ostensibly to request an interview for a more balanced piece, and let slip, with a satisfaction he could not fully disguise, that he believed he had identified the Duke's anonymous champion, and that his Grace might be interested indeed, amused to learn it was no gentleman at all, but a governess at Aldermere Grange, scribbling above her station in a man's borrowed name. I was in the room. I saw his Grace go very still, the particular stillness that in him meant a storm was gathering just beneath the surface of his composure, and I saw him say, with a courtesy so exact it was itself a kind of warning, that he was obliged to Mr. Crick for the intelligence and would look into the matter himself, and that Mr. Crick might now leave Thistledown and not trouble to return. The moment the library door closed behind the editor, his Grace turned to me, and I had never in 11 years seen his face wear quite that expression, caught between anger and wonder, and something that looked almost like fear, the fear of a man realizing he has been standing at the edge of something enormous without once looking down. "Is it true?" he said. "I do not know, Your Grace," I said, which was, at that moment, still honest, though even as I said it, the cook's idle remark and the ink stain and the quickness of Tuke's denials were arranging themselves in my mind into a shape I could no longer pretend not to see. "Find out," he said, "tonight, if you can. I must know before Crick decides discretion is not worth his while and prints it for the whole county's amusement." I rode to the Grange myself that evening, in a cold, driving rain that seemed entirely suited to the errand, and asked to speak with Miss Winthrop on a private matter concerning his Grace. She received me in the small parlor Mrs. Ashford kept for such visits, and I watched her face while I told her, as gently as I knew how, what Crick had learned and threatened. I have delivered a great many difficult messages in my years of service, and I have rarely watched anyone take one with such contained grief. "He knows, then," she said very quietly, and it was not a question. "He knows what Crick believes, Miss. He has not yet heard it confirmed by anyone he trusts. I came to ask you the truth before I carried anything further to him, because I thought you ought to be the one to decide how he learns it, if learn it he must." She was silent a long moment, her hands folded very still in her lap, and when she spoke, it was with the same plain, unflinching honesty I had heard her use on the Duke himself, months before, at an assembly that now seemed to belong to a much simpler world. "I wrote them," she said, "every one. I have wanted, 100 times, to stop, or to sign my own name and be done with the pretense, and I could never quite make myself do either. I told myself it did not matter who spoke, so long as the truth was spoken, that a widow's son kept his school, that a tenant kept his cottage, that a good man was not made a villain merely because he could not bring himself to defend his own goodness in public. I told myself that." She looked up at me, and her composure, for the first time, showed a crack of something rower beneath it. "But I will not pretend to you, Mr. Penrose, that it was only ever principle. I began writing because I could not bear to watch a man be slandered who did not deserve it. I continued, I think, because somewhere in the writing of it I came to—" She stopped herself, visibly, and pressed her lips together, and did not finish the sentence, though I believe we both knew perfectly well what word she had swallowed. "He wishes to know," I said, as gently as the errand allowed. "Not to expose you, Miss Winthrop. I do not believe that is in his nature, whatever the county fears of him. He wishes only to know who has defended him so faithfully and for so long, so that he may thank them properly. I do not think he yet imagines it might be you. I think, if I am honest, some quieter part of him already does and is afraid to say so. And if I ask you to say nothing, to let Mr. Crick print his gossip and be damned, and let me deny it, and go on as I have gone on, then I would keep your confidence, miss, as you asked it of me," I said. "But I do not think it is a confidence you truly wish kept. I think you have carried it alone a long while, and I think it has grown heavier than a woman ought to carry by herself, whatever the reason she began." She looked at me for a long moment, and then, Unexpectedly, she laughed, a small, unsteady sound, not without tears in it. "You are a very shrewd man, Mr. Penrose, for a steward who claims to know nothing." "I know a great many things I am not paid to say aloud, Miss Winthorpe. It is the whole art of my profession." She came to Thistledown herself, 2 days later, on a raw, bright February morning with frost still silvering the hedgerows, and asked to see his Grace in the library. I brought her to him myself, and at her quiet request, remained by the door, for she said she would rather have a witness to what she meant to say than trust it afterward to memory and rumor alone, hers or his. He rose when she entered, and I watched him take in the sight of her with new eyes, the way a man looks at a familiar room when he has just learned it contains a door he never noticed, searching her face for the stranger he had corresponded with all winter without a name, and finding, instead, only the woman he had somehow, without ever quite deciding to, come to think of before falling asleep. "Miss Winthorpe," he said, "I am told Mr. Crick believes he has uncovered my mysterious champion." "He has, your Grace," she said, and did not look away from him, though I saw what the stillness cost her. "It was never a stranger's cause I took up. I do not know, entirely, when it stopped being only conscience and became something else, but I have written every pamphlet the Courier has answered this 12-month, under a name that was never mine, because I did not think the world would trouble to read a governess's arguments, however sound, and I knew it would read a gentleman's." He did not speak at once. I watched something move behind his eyes, the pamphlets rising up in memory, I think, phrase by remembered phrase, each one refitting itself now to her voice, her particular economy of language, the very quality he had praised in her without once suspecting its source. A man who builds a school for children not his own has spent more on this county's future than any editor who has only ever spent ink. I saw him hear it again, in her voice this time instead of a stranger's, and I saw the exact moment the whole shape of the past year rearranged itself around that single fact. "The letter about the school," he said slowly. "You wrote that the week after Crick printed his piece about the closure." "Yes." "You knew the children's names, their fathers' trades." "I asked Mrs. Ashford's steward for the parish rolls, and told him I wished to send the poorer families a Christmas basket. It was not entirely a lie. And the ledger figures, in the very first pamphlet, the rents, the repairs to the Marsh Lane cottages. Mr. Tooks let me sit an evening with the estate accounts you had once shown Mr. Ashford, when the two of you disputed the hedge boundary. I remembered more of them than I ought to have. I have always had a memory for figures. It has been, on the whole, more curse than gift, in a life meant for embroidery and French verbs. He crossed the room to where she stood, not quickly, but with the deliberate, careful pace of a man who does not trust his own hands not to shake, and stopped close before her, closer than strict propriety allowed, with only a steward for witness, though I confess I did not think in that moment to object. "A year," he said, and his voice was not steady for all his care with it. "A year, Miss Winthorpe, I have gone about this county believing myself despised by every soul in it save one stranger I could not name, and thanking Providence in my worse hours for that one voice. And it was you. It was you the whole while, sitting across from me in your friend's library, letting me praise your economy of language to your own face, and never once telling me you had already spent it entire in my defense." "I was afraid," she said, and here, at last, her composure gave a little, though she did not look away. "Not of Mr. Crick. I have never much feared Mr. Crick, whatever damage his paper could do me. I was afraid of you, your Grace. Afraid of what it would mean once you knew, if you thanked me the way a duke thanks a useful stranger, and I understood all at once that I did not want to be thanked. I wanted," she stopped again, exactly as she had stopped with me 2 days before, and this time it was he who finished it, low, wondering, as though the words surprised him even as he spoke them. "You wanted to be known," he said. "As I have come, this winter, without in the least understanding why, to want to know you, I called at the Grange a dozen times on excuses so thin I am ashamed to recall them, Miss Winthorpe, and told myself each time it was the hedge, or the book, or the tenant dispute, and it was never once any of those things. It was you. It has been you since the assembly, since you told me I seemed to be somewhere else entirely, and were quite right. And I have spent 5 months failing to notice that the woman occupying my thoughts and the voice defending my name were the very same person, because I could not conceive that I might be permitted so much good fortune at once. You are not angry, she said, and it was not quite a question, though it carried all the uncertainty of one. I do not know what I am, he said, with the ghost of a laugh, unsteady as her own had been in my presence 2 days before. Grateful, humbled, a little ashamed that it took another man's malice to make me see plainly what my own eyes should have shown me months ago. But not angry, Miss Winthorpe Surreys, if I may finally call you what I ought to have troubled to think of you as, long before now. I do not think I have it in me to be angry at the one person in this county who never once flattered me and never once despised me, only told the truth about me until the truth was heard. He reached for her hand then, not the practiced, correct touch of a drawing room, but something slower, more searching, as though he were asking a question his voice had not yet found the courage to ask outright. She let him take it, and I saw her glove was the one she wore to hide the ink stain, and I saw him turn her hand gently in his, and find the place at the edge of her glove where a faint dark mark showed through the worn kid leather, the same stain I had noticed and excused a dozen times without understanding what it truly signified. There, he said softly, brushing his thumb, very lightly, over that small betraying mark. I might have known you a year ago, if I had only thought to look at your hands instead of listening to what the county told me a governess was permitted to be. Most people do not think to look, she said, and her voice was not quite steady now either. It is, I have found, the whole of a governess's education, to be seen everywhere and looked at nowhere. I had grown rather used to it. I did not expect a duke to be the one who finally troubled to look. Then I have a great deal of looking to make up for, he said, and I find, Surreys, that I should like a lifetime in which to do it, if you will permit a man who was too slow to see you plainly to spend the rest of his days making certain he never fails to see you again. I will not set down every word that passed between them after that, for some things belong to the two people who spoke them, and not to the memory of a steward standing discreetly by a library door, however honored he was to have been asked to stand there. I will say only that I saw her hand tighten in his, and saw him bring it at last to his lips, with a gentleness I had not known the Onyx Duke possessed until that morning, and I understood that whatever the county had called him, tyrant, brute, a man of stone, none of it had ever been true in the one room that mattered, and that it had taken a governess with an ink-stained glove and a borrowed man's name to prove it to him, and to the rest of Belhaven Cross besides. Mr. Crick printed his story after all, some days later, sneering that the Duke of Thistledown had been championed, unknowing, by a mere governess presuming to a gentleman's opinions. It did him no good whatever. By the time the piece appeared, half the county already knew, from Tukes, who could not have been prouder of the secret he'd kept so long once he was finally free to boast of it, and from the Ashfords, who told the tale with the particular relish of people who had housed a heroine unawares. And the story that spread through Belhaven Cross was not of a governess presuming above her station, but of a duke wise enough in the end to fall in love with a woman, for the very qualities the world had trained him not to notice in her. They were married in the spring, in the small parish church where she had once knelt to pin a torn hem and first spoken to him in earnest, and I stood near the back with the rest of the household, watching him watch her come up the aisle, and I thought that I had never in 11 years of service seen the Onyx Duke look less like stone, and more like a man who had finally been given every reason to be warm. Old Tukes, invited as a guest of honor he insisted he did not deserve, wept without shame through the whole ceremony, and told anyone who would listen afterward that he had known all along it would come to this, which was, perhaps, only a little more true than not. She kept her lap desk after the wedding, and her ink, though she no longer had cause to hide the stain it left, and I have since seen His Grace himself fetch her a fresh nib without being asked, the way another man might fetch his wife a shawl against the cold, because he had come, by then, to understand that her mind at work was as dear to him as her hand in his, and that a woman who had spent a year defending his good name from the shadows deserved, for the whole of her life afterward, never to have to write from one again. I have served this house the better part of my life, through hard winters and harder gossip, and I have watched the Duke of Thistledown weather a great many storms without once seeing him truly at peace, until the morning he learned that the voice which had defended him all that long, uncertain year, and the quiet, watchful woman who had somehow become the whole of his happiness besides, had never been two people at all, but one patient, unseen, and entirely his. Long before either of them had the courage to say so aloud, it remains, of everything I have witnessed in this house, the thing I am proudest to have carried in my small way between them, not a message in the end, but the truth of two hearts that had already found each other, and only needed a little help to say the name. I think of it still, on quiet evenings, when I pass the library and see them there together. She at her writing table by the window where the light falls best, he in his chair with some estate paper he is pretending to read while he watches her instead. And I remember the man who once stood at that same window with a newspaper crushed in his fist, certain the whole world had turned against him, never guessing that the truest friend he had was already closer than his own shadow. It is, I have come to believe, the gentlest kind of miracle a house like this can hold. Not that a duke found his duchess, though that is miracle enough, but that a woman who had spent so long unseen was, at the last, seen entirely, and loved without reservation for every quiet, ink-stained, unheralded part of herself that the world had never troubled to notice until he did.